All right. Good morning. This is Chris Mark, and today is Monday, February 19th, 2024. It's a beautiful day. I apologize. Got a little bit of a, a problem with my throat. So hopefully I'm not coughing too much on the phone. So this is going to be a podcast today. We are going to talk about guns, liberty, and media. And, because of the topic, you'll notice the t-shirt I'm wearing. This is Brian Terry Foundation. There's a picture of Brian Terry, a true American hero. He was killed December 15th, 2010. I was fortunate to have worked with Brian and served with him in the Marine Corps. Tremendous man. He was part of the Border Patrol tactical group, BORTAC, and he was shot while doing his job by some Mexicans, and they were actually Mexican, cartel members that were using guns supplied by none other than the Obama administration under what's called the Fast and Furious. If you're not familiar with that, look it up. It's called Fast and Furious. So, in essence, what was happening is the Obama administration, with Attorney General Holder, they were allowing drug cartels and drug and gun smugglers to buy weapons in the United States, smuggle them into Mexico, and then ostensibly so that they could track the firearms, see how much they were used for crime. Well, not surprisingly, they lost track of most of the firearms. One of them was used to kill Brian Terry. Tremendous man, tremendous Marine, good person. So because we are doing that today, I am now, decked out with my American flag hat, Brian Terry t-shirt. It's a great topic, near and dear to my heart, near and dear to a lot of people's heart. Again, we're in election season now, so we're going to hear a lot about guns coming up. We just had two shootings. We had one at Lakewood Church here not too far from me, Joel Osteen's church, where a transvestite walked into the church with his or her son. I don't know how they were identifying that day, was shot by security. And then we had another one where two thugs, and I know that that's a racist dog whistle according to the governor, but two thugs that were underage juveniles got into a shootout at the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl parade and wounded, I think, 22 people. And again, the mayor of Kansas City said calling them thugs is a racist dog whistle. Well, I don't know what you call a couple of juveniles wielding guns in public and shooting each other and shooting up the crowd other than thugs. So we're going to talk about guns today. Guns are, a big part of American history. It's codified in our Constitution, the right to bear arms. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm using a new platform, StreamYard, and I want to thank my good friend Mitchell Bell. His call sign is, of course, the military's creative Taco. He was a C-130 he was a C-130 pilot in the Marine Corps. He's got his own podcast. If you want to watch it, I was on it a few months ago, called Tall Tales with Taco, where he has just all kinds of people on and he interviews them and does a very, very good job. So Tall Tales with Taco. So without further ado, we're going to get into this. I've got a number of slides. The reason for that, and for anybody just listening, not watching, you can go, you can download the slides on my YouTube if you want, or you can see them. I wanted to make sure I'm going to be quoting some people and quoting some statistics, and I wanted to make sure I had them accurate as I can. Anytime you speak extemporaneously, like in a podcast or whatever, you run the risk of kind of getting things wrong. I'm sure I'll get a few things wrong here. It's not intentional, but we will do our best. So without further ado, let's get into the sniper's perspective, guns, liberty, and media. So let's talk quickly about guns and gun violence. And let me disabuse people of the notion of gun violence. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about the phrasing of that term, gun violence. Guns are not innately or inherently violent. They don't perpetrate any kind of violence. They're simply tools. No different than my garden sprayer. A gun is a tool. They can be used for hunting. They can be used for self-defense. They can just be used as toys for entertainment. You go to the range and you shoot. They're tools. But the left, adopting this term gun violence, anthropomorphizes these inanimate objects and gives them intent and will by saying, well, we have gun violence. So, I've got a closet full of guns, all locked up, of course. My guns have never snuck out of the window at night and perpetrated any kind of crimes. In the United States now, we have 1.2 guns for every person in the U.S. We have 350 million, at last count, about 349 million people in the United States. So, we've got close to about 400 million guns in the United States. 400 million. It's a big part of our culture, like a lot of things. But again, gun violence is a misnomer. Guns don't commit violence. People commit violence using guns and other things. This may shock a lot of people because this always seems to get in the press, that nasty black rifle called an AR-15. Well, according to the FBI, in the latest stats they had in 2022, I believe, total of all of the murders, 382 people were killed with rifles of any sort. Now, just for the sake of assuaging those on the far left to say, yeah, but it's AR-15s, we'll go ahead and say that, fine, all 382 of those people were killed using AR-15s. 382 people. There were over 600 people killed by hammers and fists. But we don't call it hammer and fist violence. We call it gun violence. We're going to explain why the media loves to use that term, and we're going to talk about why it's easy to blame guns. So without further ado, let me jump into the presentation. And again, I've got some slides, so you're going to see my beautiful grinning face here on the left, and I may play with this a little bit to see what I like doing best. But again, without further ado. So I've got a couple of quotes up here that I think are instructive. The two quotes: "There is no hunting like the hunting of man, and those who have hunted armed men long enough and liked it never care for anything else thereafter." That's attributed to Ernest Hemingway, and he's talking about combat and he's talking about warfare. And that actually used to greet you at the entrance to Marine Corps sniper schools out in Stone Bay. And I would say that's true. I want you to remember that quote. And on the right-hand side is a quote by General John Pershing. He was actually known as Blackjack Pershing. And the reason for that is he was the first general to lead an entire black command back in, gosh, I think it was pre-World War I, actually. I think it was the Mexican-American War, but it's escaping right now. And he said, "The most dangerous weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle." I don't think you can see the bottom of that slide, but I use some predicate logic because he makes a very interesting observation here that I think we ought to pay attention to. The weapon to which General Pershing is referring is not the rifle. It's not the Marine. It is the Marine and his rifle. So a weapon can be defined as a function of a Marine and his rifle in this context, or a criminal and a pistol, or a criminal and a hammer. Therein lies a weapon. Without a person with ill intent, potentially malice, violence in their heart, a firearm is nothing but a piece of metal and plastic, or metal and wood, and that's it. Much like a hammer is a piece of metal and wood, unless it's wielded by somebody with ill intent. So the weapon itself is the Marine and his or her rifle. We're going to come back to this, but again, it's important to understand what a weapon is. Can a firearm be a weapon? Certainly it can. Can that sprayer that I use on my yard be a weapon that I was just talking about? Yes. In 1964, in Cologne, Germany, a gentleman decided to take a bug sprayer. He filled it with gasoline, walked into a school, and using this bug sprayer filled with gasoline, sprayed and fired, turned it into a flamethrower, and killed 11 students and wounded 22. He was killed in the attack as well. In that capacity, here is a person using a bug sprayer filled with gasoline to kill a bunch of kids in school. In China, we've heard about this, and in Japan, we've had people go on knife attacks in China where 15 people were killed with a person with a knife. So we are not that unique. Do we have potentially more gun violence per capita? Well, it depends. You can look at a lot of the stats. So we're going to explain a couple of things and how to parse stats. I do have some book references in this, so pay attention to those because they're great books for those that have an interest in the topic. Now, for me, that is a picture of me south of the border many years ago. You can tell by the camis and the fact that, boy, I don't have many wrinkles on my face, and I'm using an M48-2 at that point, which I think they're on the A6 right now. As you can see on my arm, I am certainly a Second Amendment supporter. Mullen Labe right there. Come and take them. So am I biased? I'm sure people will think I am biased, and I'm perfectly fine with that. But hopefully this educates some folks. Let's talk about our feckless leader, to blast Joe Biden. And again, I'm going to pull this whole slide up, so hopefully you can see it. Let's see. Let's fill up the whole screen. There we go. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know why we can't see that whole thing. So our feckless leader, President Joe Biden, he was talking one day and talking about an AR-15. They had had a shooting or something, and he decided to opine on this. Now, here's a man that spent 38 years in Congress, in the Senate. You'd think he'd be a little more knowledgeable on things like firearms, but obviously, feckless Joe Biden is not. And so we're stuck with what we've got. So the first quote, he said he was explaining to his wife, and he said, I said, Jill, if there's ever a problem, just walk out on the balcony here, walk out and put that double barrel shotgun and fire two blasts outside the house. That's highlighted for a reason. You don't need an AR-15. It's harder to aim. It's harder to use. And in fact, you don't need 30 rounds to protect yourself. I'm willing to bet that Mr. Biden has never had to protect himself. I'm quite certain he's never fired an AR-15 or any kind of firearm like that. And more disturbing about his comment here is he is advising his wife that if there's ever, quote, a problem. Now, what we can infer by his statement is if somebody drives into his driveway and is potentially threatening his, his Corvette, or maybe he's saying that because of those classified documents in his garage. But irrespective, he's advising a civilian to walk outside of the house and illegally fire two blasts outside of the house. Fire two blasts outside of the house. One, terrible advice. Two, completely illegal. If not unethical, I mean, it's at least not unethical, immoral, but it's illegal. But this is the advice from our feckless president who's trying to regulate guns. And then he had another comment later on where he said, instead of standing there and teaching a cop when there's an unarmed person coming at him with a knife or something. Now, maybe President Biden doesn't recognize this fact, but a knife is a weapon if wielded, as we talked about, in the hands of somebody with violence in their heart or malice. So I don't understand how an unarmed person has a knife. It just, again, shows absolute blatant ignorance on behalf of the president. Shoot him in the leg instead of in the heart. Once again, Mr. President just demonstrating his absolute ignorance of all things self-protection or anything else. So if anybody's interested, and all my friends can certainly explain this to you, and I can as well. There's something called the 21-foot rule when we're talking about self-defense and protection. And in essence, if you have to have a firearm out to protect yourself, police learn this as well. You want to maintain 21 feet between yourself and that person, especially if they've got a knife. The reason for that is it takes about a tenth of a second for your brain to recognize and begin acting on movement. It takes about another fifth of a second for you to actually start that motion. A person that knows what they're doing and comes at you can close that 21 feet faster than you have the ability to pull that pistol out and get a shot off. So you want to keep 21 feet. So a person with the knife is extraordinarily dangerous. So for him to say, well, shoot him in the heart. Here's the other thing. And again, we're not going to talk about combat in here, but if you've ever watched the military, special operations, infantry, whomever, and even police officers practicing their tactics for reloading, tap, rack, bang. What do you do when you've got a failure, right? A failure to feed. What do you do when you've got a malfunction with your weapon? And you practice over and over. The reason you do that is to imprint muscle memory, because in a very, very high stress situation, like a gunfight, you get tunnel vision, you lose your fine motor skills, and it comes down to gross motor skills and muscle memory. So I know the movies, which I'm sure that's, Biden's sole experience with combat of any sort, is, it looks sexy and cool to simply pull it out and shoot somebody in the leg. It doesn't work that way. What everybody is trained to do and should be trained to do, except for very specific situations, is you fire center mass. You're not trying to kill anybody. You're not trying to do anything. What you're trying to do is stop the threat. Stop the threat. So again, just showing the absolute blind ignorance of our commander in chief to tell somebody, hey, just shoot him in the leg. Don't shoot him in the heart. And here is the guy driving, our gun control discussion. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. Why blame guns? Okay, guys, here's where I'm sure I'm going to get hate mail and people threatening to kill me. I've had that happen before. All these nonviolent, gun rights advocate or gun advocates, gun control advocates, tend to send me very, very vitriolic, nasty messages saying I'm going to find your family and all kinds of stuff. Okay, so why do we blame guns? One, it's politically lazy and convenient. Okay. It's intellectual laziness, and it's an easy target for complex issues. Look, talking about topics like sex with your kids when they get to that age, uncomfortable, difficult, sometimes indelicate. Talking about security, indelicate, uncomfortable. Talking about political issues where we have to look at things like demographic statistics, things like that, it can be an uncomfortable topic. It can be complex. It can certainly be indelicate, but it can't be ignored. But it's very easy for people to do that. So what is the tendency to do with those people too intellectually lazy to actually look at the research, understand the issues? Well, it's very easy. You simply put the blame on an inanimate object. It is the gun's fault. It is a gun's fault. Great book here. One of the first recommendations I said I was going to give you came out in 2001, I believe. The first issue, 2005. I'm sorry, 2001. They have now come out with the updated version. It's called Freakonomics by Levitt and Dubner. Absolutely fantastic book. They talk about a lot of neat subjects. They're economists, and they take economic theory and they apply it to social issues. So one of the things they do, and again, here's where when we talk about topics being indelicate and uncomfortable, we're going to talk about one. In the 1990s, crime dropped off precipitously. And of course, everybody did a victory lap. You know, you had Bill Clinton doing a victory lap. Joe Biden was in the Senate. He did a victory lap. They were all taking claim for doing this. And what these economists demonstrated was it had nothing to do with the crime policies that were implemented, the crime control policies that were implemented. What it had to do was something that was legalized in 1973, and that was abortion. So if you look at the crime and who's committing the crime, it tended to be kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, single homes, growing up impoverished, things like that. But what was happening after 1973, those kids were not being born at the same rate. They were being aborted before they had a chance to be born. And so that's why the crime drop off. Now, is that a great topic for most people to talk about at the dinner table? Probably not. It's a pretty indelicate topic, pretty tough to have to acknowledge that and look around and go, oh, that, it kind of stinks. But that's the reality. And again, this is not my opinion. This comes from economic theory. And as you can see here, in 2020, they published an update and they said, we estimate that crime fell roughly 20% between 1997 and 2014 due to legalized abortion. Now, prior to that, in their first publishing, it had gone down even more. The cumulative impact of legalized abortion on crime is roughly 45%, accounting for a very substantial portion of the roughly 50 to 55%, like I said, overall decline from the peak of crime in the early 1990s. Politically lazy and politically convenient. Have you ever asked yourself, so we just had this shooting once again at the Super Bowl parade. Two thugs, underage thugs, decided to shoot at each other, shot a bunch of people. President Biden once again comes out and says, we have to do something about it. It's really fascinating that when shootings seem to get press, it's when it's white people being shot. And the reason I'm saying that, I'm not saying that to be racist and saying, well, black people shooting white people. What I'm saying is all of these people that are these anti-gun advocates, if you look at, the what used to be called the Million Moms March and Shannon Watts and all these people that have these comments and gosh, we need to control guns. They only seem to get vocal when it's people that look like them that get shot. We got black people in inner city, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Dallas, Houston. I live in the Houston area, being shot daily, being shot annually by the scores, if not the hundreds. That's okay, though. That apparently is not an issue for them. But let one person walk into a white church and shoot up a couple of people, which statistically, and again, I'm not trying to diminish anybody being shot by a gun. It's tragic, but statistically, it's exceedingly rare, but it's impactful. But boy, if it's a person that looks like you now, rah, 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 we got to control guns. I notice they don't have much to say when these black kids without any upward mobility, no jobs, no opportunity are shooting each other down in the streets. That seems to be okay for these folks. And you have to ask yourself why. So I've been writing on this for about the last, 10 years. Here's a blog post I wrote in 2016. We're going to talk about a few things that, again, I'm not going to cast aspersions on the media industry, movies, or anything else, but there are some things that we need to talk about because it is important to have these indelicate discussions and let people understand it. So here's a blog post I wrote, globalriskinfo.com, back in 2016. You can just do a search on my blog if you want to read it. Lots of interesting references in there, things like that. Just a couple of quick stats. Gun ownership in the US has varied between 37 and 42% since 1972. Related death index is approximately 10.9 per 100,000 people. Now that's murder overall, not guns. Opioid overdoses accounted for 77,000 of the 98,000 total drug overdoses in 2020. Of that, 65.5% alone was fentanyl overdoses. Drug-related deaths are 32.4% one per 100,000. Now we've been, kind of calling for controls on this. We know where the opioids are coming from. We know where fentanyl is coming from. It's coming across our porous border. We know that the drug cartels are bringing it in. A lot of it's manufactured in China, goes down, gets brought across our border. 32.4 per 100,000. Yet that's not even on the radar of this administration. Guns, however, those black rifles, AK or the AR-15s, boy, that's what we need to control. Understand this: gun control is nothing but people control. It was interesting. George Takei, who played Mr. Sulu in Star Trek, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and keep in mind they used to be part of the Soviet Union. Russia still considers Ukraine part of Russia, obviously. So when they invaded Ukraine, George Takei came out and had a brilliant statement. He said, well, those 30 million AR-15s in civilian hands in the United States certainly could have helped a lot of Ukrainians. And I have to give credit. Somebody came out and said, hey, thank you, genius. You just articulated exactly why we have a Second Amendment. It is for things like that, to ensure our government stays in check. And I said this in a podcast earlier, and I'm sure, people take exception, whatever. Joe Biden said, to fight the U.S. government, you don't need rifles, you need F-15s. No, you don't. Insurgencies work. Insurgencies work. They have worked throughout history. Afghanistan, the British Empire, the land where empires die. The British Empire lost twice over there. The Soviets lost. The U.S., arguably, did we accomplish our goals? Probably not. The Taliban's in there now, still in control. Insurgencies work. Iraq, Vietnam. Look at where insurgencies have been successful. They do work. So it is facile at best for Biden to say, well, a bunch of Americans with rifles aren't going to do anything against the U.S. military. No, you get 100 million Americans defending their country and their homeland with rifles. Trust me, that's a lot of people to fight. So it does work. How to Lie with Statistics. Another great book, came out in 1956. I love it, and it tells you how to lie with statistics. So one of the things I want to caution everybody about, and I have to be careful when I am speaking as well, is certain, it's easy to use language that appears to be, statistically related, and people will put qualifiers and all kinds of things up there. So we have to be careful. So understand, rate is not the same as an absolute number. The United States, and I checked this yesterday, we're the third most populated country in the world. We have 350 million people. Above us is China with about 1.45 million. Above them is India with about 1.5 million. We're a distant third, but we're third, 350 million people. That's a heck of a lot of people living in our country. So if we were to say, the United States has more murders than any other country in the world, well, we're a giant country, so that doesn't really surprise many people. So you have to look at rate. What we need to be concerned with is, what is the rate of an incident happening per X amount of people? Vividness effect. This is something I just hit on. Dramatic or vivid events or stats have a greater impact on perception. This is what's called a heuristic bias. So a person with an AR-15 or some kind of knockoff AR-15 shooting a child in a school, even though statistically it's a very, very, very extremely small chance of that happening, it tugs at the heartstrings. We say, wow, here's a person with an AR-15 shot a kid. Oh my gosh, we have to stop this. We ignore the 500 kids a year shooting each other up in South Side of Chicago and Philly and all those places. Vividness effect. And so media loves to spin things by saying, oh my gosh, look how terrible this is. Somebody walked into a church and they did X and Y and Z. Qualifiers and qualifiers. So they may be more likely to be more inclined to trend. These are all qualifiers. They don't have any statistical relevance or anything. If I say, well, there appears to be a trend that bald-headed former Marines, do podcasts, well, that doesn't mean anything. That means anecdotally, it looks like something may be happening here. So again, we always have to be careful about things like that. And then finally, come hawk or go propter hawk. You will see, especially in statistics, a lot of people will say, "Hey, explain to me why when this happens, that happens, and how one doesn't cause the other." Come hawk or go propter hawk means because of this and therefore that. It's Latin. It's a confusing correlation with causality. So I'll give you a great example. In the United States, there's a positive correlation. It means both events track in the same direction. As one increases, the other increases. There is a positive correlation with ice cream consumption and snake bites. Ice cream consumption and snake bites. Now, does one cause the other? Absolutely not. I think anybody with half a brain figured out there's a confounding variable in there. There's a third variable, and that's temperature. When it gets hot, snakes come out, they're more active. People are outside more often, they eat more ice cream. Therefore, you typically have more snake bites and more ice cream consumption. One does not have any relevance on the other at all. There is a what's called a confounding variable in there. But you will see, especially in gun stats, you'll see a lot of people say, well, X and Y. And the idea there is to get you to believe that one causes the other, or there's anything more than just, again, a specious or a kind of a correlation, if you will. So researchers, sorry, my nose is really bugging me. Sorry, guys. Researchers at the University of Pittsburgh teamed up with the Pittsburgh Police Department in 2016 to look at almost 900 firearms recovered from crime scenes. They found the criminals didn't possess them in 80% of the cases. And adding to that, the FBI has estimated that up to 85% of guns used in homicides were illegally obtained. So the question becomes, well, why are you trying to impose more rules on me? My guns have never done anything. I certainly have never committed a crime with a gun. It's people obtaining them illegally that are doing this. And a study from the University of Chicago looked at 99 inmates at the county jail in 2015 and found only 3% of those inmates who used a gun bought it at a gun store. Now, we don't know if they got them through other means legally, but I'm guessing they didn't. The vast majority of people that buy guns are going to buy them at a gun store or maybe at a swap meet or whatever. You're still required to have a background check, and we hear this all the time. Background checks are not required at gun shows. Absolutely they are. You can't just walk in there. Now, if a friend, my sister, wants to buy one of my rifles, am I allowed to legally sell that to her without doing a background check? Yes, absolutely, I can. Now, if I know that she's a felon or something like that, that's illegal. Now, if I were to purchase a gun legally for somebody else, that's called a straw purchase. 100% illegal. Can't do that at all. So let's talk just quickly about the Second Amendment. I'm not going to belabor this too much because we have so many in our country constitutional scholars, and this gets debated ad infinitum. Second Amendment codifies our right to keep and bear arms. It says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed. Now, we have people parsing this all the time saying, well, the comma there after the first, clause means that this only applies to a militia and so on and so forth. And that's why we have the Supreme Court to decide these issues as to interpretation of our Second Amendment. But we're unique, relatively unique in the United States in that we have a constitutional, absolute, inalienable right to keep and bear arms. And when people say, well, why do you need an AR-15? My response is pretty simple. None of your damn business. I have a right to have one. Therefore, if I want to have one, I can have one. You don't have to have a demonstrable need to own a rifle or any kind of gun, with a few exceptions, those that are covered under the National Firearms Act. There are 3 lawsuits that are kind of relevant right now, and those were decided by the Supreme Court. The first one, we just call it Heller, DC versus Heller. They affirmed for the first time that the right belongs to individuals for self-defense in the home, while also including as dicta, that means it's not formalized yet and can't be used as a predecessor, that the right is not unlimited, does not preclude the existence of certain longstanding prohibitions, such as those forbidding the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or those that are addicted to illicit drugs. Case in point, it is illegal for somebody that is a crack addict to fill out their SF or their ATF 74 document and say, no, I don't use illicit drugs, I'm not an addict, and then buy a gun. And yes, I am talking about Hunter Biden, who lied on his ATF form. It was very well known that he was a crack addict. He's acknowledged it. Illegal for him to own a gun. He lied about it, got a gun, and then more disturbingly, when he decided to dispose of it, what did he do with it? He threw it in a dumpster next to an elementary school. They took some wipings from his gun case, and it came up positive for cocaine. So there are limits on who can own and possess firearms. That is one of them. In McDonald v. Chicago's Supreme Court ruled that state and local governments are limited to the same extent as a federal government from infringing upon this right. We see this not infrequently. Recently, the state of Hawaii decided that, and I'm not making this up, the quote, spirit of aloha, end quote, trumps the Second Amendment, which they are now restricting citizens' rights to keep and bear arms, and their rationale as well. Hawaii's different. We have this thing here called the quote spirit of aloha, which means we all just sit around and sing kumbaya, I guess. Absolutely ridiculous. I have no doubt that the Supreme Court's going to hear that, shoot it down. But again, state and local governments, you can't overreach what the federal government says. And then, of course, New York State Rifle and Pistol v. Bruin assured the right to carry weapons in public spaces with reasonable exceptions. Reasonable exceptions. You can't tell people in most cases, hey, you can't take one for self-protection into a park. Now, when we start talking, I'm gonna segue a little bit now into media and video games, and I think it's relevant for a reason, and we'll talk about this. Um, these quotes right here are from the director of what are arguably the most violent movies that we've had for the last 30 years, Quentin Tarantino. Now, Quentin Tarantino absolutely disavows any responsibility for any violence, and he actually has said, "You can't blame me for what somebody does after watching one of my movies." Here is somebody that is absolutely in favor of gun control in all of its forms. Yet these are just a select few of his quotes. Violence is one of the most fun things to watch. He said in 2006, violence is one of the most fun things to watch. I just think, there's violence in the world. Tragedies happen. Blame the playmakers. It's a Western. Give me a break. If I've made it a little easier for artists to work in violence, great. I've accomplished something. Violence in real life is terrible. Violence in movies can be cool. It's just another color to work with. 1994. Violence is fun, man, he said in 2004. Then he said, violence is a form of cinematic entertainment. Ask me about violence is like going up to Vincente Minnelli and asking him to justify his musical sequences in '03. Well, granted, I like his movies. I think he's a good director, but I think that's kind of a reach right there. But we see this over and over, these folks in Hollywood that participate in movies that are hugely violent. They support them, they produce them, they promote them. And then when it comes time to talk about guns, they're all about gun control. I hate to say it, Matt Damon has waded into this. Liam Neeson, if you remember that movie Taken, where he said, I have a particular set of skills. One of the most violent movies you're ever going to see. Liam Neeson came out and is absolutely an advocate for gun control. So is Cameron Diaz. A bunch of people in Hollywood want gun control, but they have absolutely no problem going out there making hugely, hugely, horribly violent movies. And they just claim, well, it's just acting. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So now we have a gun control advocate, a quote here from a woman named Donna Finkelstein. So I looked her up and I said, who is this woman? So she's part of the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence. Well, she's a retired school counselor. You know what? School counselors have a very important job, not denigrating their job or anything else. Being a retired school counselor does not make her an expert on gun control, gun prevention, or anything else. What I kind of find interesting about a lot of these people that get into this, and again, the vividness, impact, the personal experience. This woman's son was shot and survived, but he was shot in a school shooting. So she decided to get involved. Brady himself, if you remember, was shot when President Reagan was attempting to be assassinated. He was shot. You've got Gabby Giffords, if you remember, she was a congresswoman from Arizona who was shot by an assassin or an attempted assassin. And when she got shot, she now became a gun control advocate. These people, suddenly after it personally impacts them, hey, now we want to be a gun control advocate. But here's something interesting that this woman said, Donna Finkelstein of the Brady campaign. And remember we talked about qualifiers and statistics. She said, and this is a direct quote, I don't hear a sense of connection between the media and glorification of guns. Well, that certainly is a personal opinion of hers, but it is written in such a way and expressed in such a way that to the uninitiated, they might go, oh, well, there is no connection. I don't hear a sense of connection between the media and glorification of guns. There absolutely is 100% media connection. Anybody that's ever seen a movie in recent times, absolutely a glorification of guns. Then she said, I don't feel the responsibility is in the entertainment industry. The problem is easy to access guns. Is that the problem? It's not that we're turning kids into weapons. Now, I'm going to make some statements here, and people listening can agree or disagree. I don't really care. I've got a lot of friends that probably are more knowledgeable than me. I was a Marine Corps sniper, and did other things, but I was a Marine Corps sniper. I have combat as a Marine Corps sniper. Well, I'm not saying I'm an expert on killing. I think I probably have greater expertise on the concepts and what it takes to do that than probably 99.9% of people in the world today. My friends certainly have I have friends that have a lot more experience than me, but it's probably common experience. So I think I probably have something to say here that's relevant. So there are two books, and if you haven't read Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, I think he may be retired now, but he was an Army psychologist, and he wrote two books. The first one, On Killing, I'm going to reference in here. He's got two more, but he's got one called On Combat. On Killing is the book I'm going to reference here. So if you don't have it, get it. He's a psychologist who's done a lot of research. He developed his own science behind killing and what it takes to kill another human being. It's called Killology. And so you can read it. Fascinating books. His research is absolutely fascinating. We're going to talk a little bit about that right now. So there are a couple of quotes here that I'm going to read to you. And again, I know that this is a lot of quotes, but I want to make sure, a lot of people opine on things like gun control and what it takes. And I don't want you to think this is just my opinion. I want to pull from experts that have expert opinions on this, because I think that gives us, a better baseline to form our arguments. And so Bushman said, well, there isn't a complete consensus in any scientific field. A study we conducted showed more than 90% of pediatricians and about 2/3 of media researchers surveyed agreed that violent video games increase aggression in children. Violent video games. So 90% of pediatricians, 2/3 of media researchers. This was in 2016. Then another psychologist said, there have been over 1,000 studies on the effects of TV and film violence over the past 40 years, 1,000. Research on the influence of TV violence on aggression has consistently shown that TV violence increases aggression and social anxiety, cultivates a mean view of the world, and negatively impacts real world behavior. Now we're getting into, recall what I said in the first part of this podcast, where I said the most dangerous weapon in the world is a Marine and his rifle, So the gun itself is a tool. But what we're doing in the media today is we're glorifying, we're training these kids, and we're inuring them to violence and violent behavior. So now, and when I say kids, well, people in society, but kids are particularly susceptible. So now we've got these kids saying it's cool to have guns and it's easy to do that. There were studies that have shown that in playing Call of Duty, in less than 2 hours of Call of Duty, a kid may actually go through and have a very real life experience, or looks like, and the graphics are absolutely amazing these days, and kill over 300 people in Call of Duty. It looks real. It's training the brain in the same way. Now, the chief of U.S. Army history, Marshall, here's a quote from him. He said, it's therefore reasonable to believe that the average healthy individual, the man who can endure mental and physical stress of combat, still has such an inner an unrealized resistance toward killing a fellow man that he will not of his own volition take a life if it is possible. Killing a human being is absolutely anathemic to who we are as people. It is not innate. It is not natural. Certainly there are people that have psychological or mental issues where it becomes easier for them. But killing a human being is anathemic to who we are. And it's very, very difficult. And if you read that book on killing, a couple of statistics come to mind. In World War II, 1% of fighter pilots accounted for 30 to 40% of the shoot downs of enemy fighter pilots. 1% were doing the work of almost 30 to 40%. Before Vietnam, it's estimated that 75% of soldiers didn't even fire their weapons in combat. When they went to the Battle of Antietam, when they went and started collecting all the weapons and the bodies and everything, they found that a lot of the rifles at the Battle of Antietam during the Civil War were double loaded, had never been fired. killing a human being is a very, very difficult thing to do. And it's something that's anthemic to us as human beings. And those statistics bear that out. You can't just wake up, most of us, certainly there are those that are inclined to be that way, but for the average person, that's not a trivial thing to do. So here's a comment by an IDF counter sniper trainer, and he said, "I made targets as human as possible." He continues, change the standard firing targets to full size, anatomically correct figures because no Syrian runs around with a big white square on his chest with numbers on it. I put clothes on these targets and polyurethane heads. I cut up cabbage and poured ketchup into it and put it back together. I said, when you look through that scope, I want you to see a head blowing up. You have to desensitize people. And this is an IDF, Israeli Defense Force counter sniper trainer saying this. We've got a USC psychologist who said the rationale you want to teach people this stuff when they're in a state of arousal. The rationale is you want to teach people this stuff when they're in a state of arousal so that they're more likely to access that learning when they're in a similar state. We want to create is something that pulls at the hearts of people. Maybe there's a child lying there with his arms blown off, screaming and crying. Maybe you kill an innocent civilian. These are all people that are training folks in the military to desensitize them so that they can kill more easily. In Vietnam, it was estimated that 95% of soldiers in Vietnam were firing their weapons in combat compared to 25% in World War II. And the reason for that is the training started to teach that. Anybody that's ever gone through Marine Corps boot camp knows the answer to this question. What makes the grass grow? And I can tell you, blood, blood, blood. What makes grass grow? Blood, blood, blood. Everything they teach you in the Marine Corps, especially in the early days of training boot camp, is designed to inure you to the idea of combat and killing. Now, certainly it doesn't replicate what you're going to see, but it gets you in that mind state. You do bayonet drills, you do a lot of fighting. They want you to be aggressive. They want you to learn those skills, and they want you in your mind to be able to deal with that. Hey, when you go to sniper school, they do more. They want to make sure that when you're behind that rifle, you have the ability to pull the trigger when the situation presents. So when we talk about do guns actually help in security and self-defense, we see stories all the time about homeowners protecting themselves. Another book I would recommend, John Lott, More Guns, Less Crime. It's a few years old now, but he's also an economist. He's got a great book, and I think this has been updated. There's a lot of great statistics in there. But one of the things he said, overall, my conclusion is that criminals as a group tend to behave rationally when crime becomes more difficult. Less crime is committed. Higher arrest and conviction rates dramatically reduce crime. But more importantly, he has a study. He pulls out a lot of statistics, and he did a study, and he compared the UK and Canada, who have much, much more strict gun laws, a lot fewer guns than the United States. And he looked at people that were in jail for what they call hot burglaries. This is burglaries when somebody is actually in the house. When somebody's in the house, how many people still break in and rob the house? In the UK and Canada, hot burglaries account for 50% of those burglaries. People are willing to break in 50% of the time when somebody is home. Compare that to the United States. The percentage is only 13% compared to 50. Why? Universally, the criminal said breaking into a house when somebody's home in the United States, that's the way to get shot. Okay, so yes, there is a deterrent effect for having firearms. So it really is frustrating when you hear all of these talking heads and liberal people say, well, nobody protects themselves. It's a much greater harm to society having guns out on the streets and having an individual saying they're going to protect themselves. Well, two things with that. Who in the hell is anybody to tell me I can't protect myself or my family? The Constitution says I can, and the lawsuits with precedent say I can. So to hell with anybody that says I should not have that right. I have that right. My wife has that right. People I care about have that right. So to hell with anybody that says I should not have it because some thugs are shooting themselves up. Sorry, we already had that one. This is just two screenshots from a couple of video games I pulled up just for this presentation, this podcast. And as you can see, the one on the left, sniper scope, there's a guy crouched down. He's about to be shot right there, about center mass, right at the base of the neck. The other one is, and again, because I'm a sniper, I tend to, like sniper shots. This one is a sniper sitting there in the kneeling position, getting ready to fire off a round at somebody. These video games have become so realistic, so absolutely realistic. And we're teaching these kids over and over and over how to kill. So what are we doing with that? Well, quite frankly, we're creating weapons. And we're teaching these kids at a younger age through media, through video games, things like that, that it's cool to have guns. Again, hey, I believe in art. I believe in the freedom of expression. I believe in the First Amendment, but we cannot ignore the impact that art has on society. Art has been used for years to foment revolution, for goodness sake. You know, look at that movie with Jennifer Lawrence, that series about the girl that foments a revolution, Mockingjay, and all of that. I mean, if you look at the media that they put behind her, hey, media is impactful. It was actually William Randolph Hearst that said, "Give me a picture, and I'll give you a war." So media does have an impact. The violence we hear in rap music, I don't think we can ignore that. The violence we see on TV, the violence that we see in video games. For goodness sakes, Grand Theft Auto has a module you can put in there that will allow you to rape people in the video game. I mean, you kill hundreds of people, you run over them with your car, you shoot them, you beat them up, you can rape people. I mean, these are things that we cannot, in my mind, ignore. If you recall back in the 1980s, it was Tipper Gore that led the charge to try to get ratings put on music. And they were trying to say, well, kids are committing suicide and crime because of music. And one of the people they had that got up as a spokesperson for heavy metal was Dee Snider. And if you've not seen the video, do yourself a favor, go on YouTube, look at the video of Dee Snider. He shows up all 6'5" with his hair teased out to no ends, skin tight jeans, wear a little cutoff denim thing showing his midriff. He's got his comments and folded up in his back pocket, and they think here comes this heavy metal guy is going to be a knucklehead. He's a teetotaler, doesn't drink, doesn't do drugs, extraordinarily well spoken. He gets up there, blows everybody away. But as far back as the 1980s, you had these people trying to say, well, we need to regulate heavy metal music. Well, and again, I do believe in the First Amendment, so it's difficult for me to say we ought to regulate these things, but I don't think we can ignore the impact it's having. Much like going to how indelicate it is to talk about these subjects. We can't ignore the fact that kids that come from single parent homes, and 80% of single parent homes, the fathers are not existing in those homes. Kids that come from single parent homes without a father, 300% more likely to carry guns. 300%. Hey, I came from a single parent home. My father was not around. My mother ended up going to jail. My dad went to jail. I mean, I grew up in that environment. Very, very, very violent. Lower socioeconomic, for lack of a better term, white trash environment. So I'm speaking from experience, but also statistics. 300% more likely to carry guns. These kids that come from lower socioeconomic environments that don't have, two-family homes, don't have that social modeling, tend to engage in crime at a much, much higher rate. You add to that the cool factor that you see in the movies, you hear in the music, see in the video games of having a gun, using guns to solve your problems. And I think we're creating that weapon, that person that in conjunction with that gun, now you've got a weapon. And again, these are just two comments about games. From a psychological perspective, video games are excellent teaching tools because they reward players for engaging in certain types of behavior. Unfortunately, in many popular video games, this behavior is violence. That came from a University of Missouri associate professor of psychology. And this is actually a quote I pulled as I was researching this little podcast. I pulled this quote from a kid that was on a blog that was talking about playing a game, which I've never played it. It's called Guild Wars. I don't know if it's a new one, an old one. This is, but I found this in an older blog post. But he said, someone comes at you with an axe intent on cleaving your skull open. There's a question. Take a breath. Keep your cool. Realize that your mind actually works a lot faster than you think it does, and try to cleave their skull open right back. So this is all play. But if you look in the animal kingdom, and even with us as human beings, a lion cub attacking another lion cub, that looks like play. They're getting that immediate feedback. They're getting that serotonin rush, but that is training them to be predators. That's training them for predation on prey. If you look at little boys, right? We used to run around with sticks or playing video games. Now, when I was that age, we loved to play war. But again, this is training you for stuff like that. So I don't think we can ignore the impact that media does have on violence and creating that. Again, The weapon is not the gun unless it is wielded by somebody intent on using it as a weapon, much like a hammer, much like a knife, much like anything else. So we can't ignore that. These discussions are indelicate, they're uncomfortable, they can be tough, but this is the world we live in. And anybody that does not believe that that's true, I think, is being intellectually dishonest as much as intellectually lazy. It is very, very easy to ascribe blame to an inanimate object and say, hey, if we just keep guns off the street, we're not going to have crime. Well, first of all, the genie is out of the bottle. We have 400 million guns in the United States. It is illegal for to require registration of guns. It is illegal. The federal government is not allowed to do that for a reason. So we have 400 million guns out there already. We're not going to, quote, get them off the streets. So they are out there. We need to look at other ways of doing it. Again, the indelicate discussion. Maybe we look at ways of elevating these kids in these impoverished neighborhoods, single family homes. We start figuring out ways to elevate them, give them some opportunities, give them some jobs, help them, things like that. But that seems to fall on deaf ears. Again, as long as poor black kids are shooting poor black kids in Detroit, the politicians don't seem to care. Generally, the American people don't seem to care. But let somebody walk in with an AR-15 and kill some white kids, and now we've got to fix this. Okay, the vividness effect, and again, it tugs at the heartstrings, just like we heard from the quotes on there. And we know what happens. The military has been using video games and simulation training, for decades to get soldiers' mindsets into that position of being able to engage in combat more effectively. When I say engage in combat more effectively, fundamentally what that means is shoot and kill more. Okay, and it's that simple. We don't necessarily want civilians running around feeling that way, but that's what we have. So guns, are not the problem. Guns in the wrong hands are the problem. Guns in the hands of people that are crack addicts that lie on their ATF forms, that's a problem. Okay. But I find it really curious that President Biden said nothing about his son illegally obtaining that gun. And what's even more curious is his son's defense now is, now you're just picking on me because I'm an addict. No, we're picking on you because you lied and you committed a felony by getting that gun that way. So when we look at society and gun control, I understand the left, and this is going to be a big topic coming up in in the election. It always is, year over year. So why is it always a big topic? If you recall, in one of my first podcasts, we talked about democratization and this concept called satisficing and what people vote for. And typically, very few Americans are single issue voters. Most of them have several, if not more, issues that they will look, but they'll prioritize those based on what's most important. In the vast majority of cases, economy is number one. The economy is doing well, then people go, well, the economy is doing well. Now I can say, who really is in line with my feelings on, gay rights or gun control or whatever the case is. When the economy is doing bad, that kind of trumps everything. But one of the primary issues, if you look at the big issues that come out during elections, the economy is always going to be number one. You're always going to have things like LGBTQIA plus. See how fast I'm getting at doing that. Rights or gay rights. You're going to have reproductive rights like abortion rights, and you're going to have gun rights, which are really important. And then you're going to have immigration. Those are kind of the five big things that come up. Typically, people that are more supportive of being able to keep and bear arms are those that fall on the right-hand side of the political spectrum. More conservative people, like myself, that get tattoos of Molabe on their forearm. So that tends to be a more conservative issue. So it becomes a very easy talking point for the left to try to convince people. Again, if they really had a concern about reducing murders and violence from guns, not gun violence, as we talked about, that's a misnomer. If they really had a concern about reducing the violence perpetrated with guns, they would be taking other actions. Instead, they're simply pointing the finger at guns, gun manufacturers, law-abiding people like myself that own guns, that have never committed a crime with a gun, have never sold a gun illegally. They're focused on guns, and guns are not the issue. As we saw, 85% of murders committed with guns are committed with guns that were obtained illegally. We know this. So how in the hell is taking my guns, restricting my guns, going to protect anybody? It's not. My guns have never gone out and done anything on their own. And I'm certainly not inclined to use them for crimes. I don't even have a concealed weapons permit, right? So again, it's misguided, but the reason for that is just a very political issue, because they want to put that divide in there and convince people, hey, gosh, guns are bad, therefore don't vote for people that support gun rights. And that's all it is. It has nothing to do with actually trying to help society or anything else. They're opportunists. They see, a shooting in Kansas City, and instead of calling a spade and saying, here's what's going on, we got a couple of little gangbanger thugs that are shooting at each other, shot a bunch of people up. They said, oh gosh, it's the people that support the guns. It's the NRA. Let's sue the NRA because they're allowing these kids to get these guns. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I appreciate everybody listening to me for a full hour. I know there's a lot of information. Hopefully, I'm going to listen to this before I publish it. Hopefully, it was not too crazy. What I would like everybody to do is, remember, Mr. Brian Terry. It was not an anniversary or anything of, and I hate to use the word anniversary, of when he passed, but he is an absolutely, tremendous person. And again, he was killed because guns were allowed to be smuggled into Mexico, and then smuggled back into the United States and used for crimes under something called the Fast and the Furious. So we have folks out there every day trying to fight this, and keep them in your heart. I appreciate you guys listening, and now you're going to get to hear me play some music. I'm figuring out how to do this on my podcast. Thank you.